When he walked into that cafe with a single rose, I thought my luck had finally changed. It was a gray Thursday morning in Portland, rain sliding down the windows like tired tears. I was sitting alone at a corner table with a paperback, more for company than for story. The cafe buzzed with students and young couples, the kind of crowd that rarely notices a woman in her 60s. Then he appeared, tall, well-dressed, carrying a single crimson rose as though the scene had been scripted. He tapped my shoulder gently. "No one should drink coffee alone on a day like this," he said, placing the rose on my table. His voice was warm, confident, the kind that made you lean in without realizing. His name was Daniel. At least, that's what he told me. From the beginning, he seemed to know exactly what to say. He asked about the book in my hands instead of my age. He told me my laugh reminded him of summer instead of commenting on the wrinkles around my eyes. He listened, really listened, in a way that made me feel I was glowing under a spotlight. We started meeting often. Dinners in cozy Italian restaurants where the waiters greeted him like an old friend. Walks along the Willamette River at dusk when the sky bled orange. He quoted poetry, slipped notes into my purse. "You deserve joy." When he brought steak and rosemary potatoes, he claimed to have cooked them himself in his condo downtown. I never saw that condo, but I wanted to believe. My church friends whispered that I had been given a second chance. My daughter, cautious as always, said, "Mom, don't rush." But how could I not? Daniel was attentive, protective, endlessly charming. After years of solitude, after losing my husband to illness and drifting through widowhood like a ghost, I felt alive again. Yet even in those early days, small shadows flickered at the edges. He always paid in cash, peeling bills from his wallet with practiced ease. He avoided photos, turning his face just as I raised my phone. And when I asked about his home, he smiled with mischief. "Here and there," he said. "Life's too short for one address." I laughed then, thinking it romantic, mysterious. But later that night, alone in bed, I caught myself wondering why a man so polished seemed to have no roots. I brushed the thought away, blaming my loneliness for inventing problems. Back then, all I wanted was to believe in him. The first cracks appeared so quietly, I almost convinced myself they weren't real. Daniel never invited me to his place. Not once. Whenever I hinted, he smiled and redirected. "Let's go somewhere special instead." And so we did. His choice of restaurants, always dimly lit, always bustling enough that no one paid much attention to us. When I pressed about his condo, he sighed dramatically. "Still under renovation. Dust everywhere. I'd be embarrassed to have you see it." The words were delivered with charm, as if he were protecting me from inconvenience. But deep down, I wondered, what kind of man renovates a place for months, yet never once brings a woman he supposedly loves to see it? Then there was his phone. It seemed glued to him, always buzzing with messages or calls. The moment it rang, he excused himself, stepping outside or into another room. Once, at my kitchen table, it lit up with an unknown number. I joked, "You're more secretive than the CIA." He kissed my hand, his lips warm and practiced. "Business never sleeps," he said, and I laughed nervously, though inside I felt a shiver. He told me he was an investor, the kind of man who always had deals cooking, real estate in Seattle, startups in Silicon Valley, old friends in need of quick loans that miraculously paid off big. But when I asked for specifics, the answers slid through my fingers like smoke. He'd change the subject, compliment my hair, or lean in with that mesmerizing gaze that made me forget the question entirely. And I wanted to forget. I wanted to trust. Hadn't I prayed for companionship after years of silence in my house? Hadn't I begged God to send someone who would sit across from me at dinner, someone who would hold my hand in the dark theater, someone who would make me feel less like a ghost moving through her own life? Daniel seemed like an answer, even if the edges didn't quite fit. But unease crept in. It was subtle at first, a whisper in the back of my mind, a knot in my stomach that refused to untangle. One night after he left, I was cleaning the kitchen when I noticed a crumpled receipt on the counter. I almost tossed it away, but a name was scribbled across the back. A different name. Not Daniel. I froze, the paper trembling in my hands. Could it be a middle name? A nickname? Something innocent? My heart wanted excuses, but my body knew better. My stomach dropped, heavy and cold. I set the receipt down and stared at it under the harsh kitchen light. The ink seemed to pulse, each letter a warning I didn't want to hear. And for the first time since meeting him, I felt something I couldn't shake. Not love, not longing. Fear. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, the house unnaturally still. I brewed a pot of coffee so strong it filled the kitchen with a bitter, almost metallic scent. The mug felt heavy in my hands, but it didn't steady them. My fingers trembled as I set it beside my laptop, the steam curling like a warning I didn't want to read. I stared at the search bar for what felt like hours. My chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. My mind pleaded with me to close the lid, to leave the mystery alone, to let the fantasy survive a little longer. But curiosity, or maybe instinct, had already won. I typed the name I'd seen on the receipt. Slowly, carefully, like each letter was a sin. At first, the results were bland. Nothing more than a skeletal LinkedIn profile with no photo, no real history, and a roofing company that seemed to have been registered years ago and abandoned. I almost exhaled in relief, ready to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Just some other man with the same name. But then, halfway down the page, a headline grabbed me by the throat. Local man arrested in multi-state fraud scheme. My hand jerked against the mouse. I clicked. And there he was, the same smile, the same dark eyes that had looked at me across candle-lit tables, the same face that had pressed against mine only hours earlier. Only now, it wasn't a lover's portrait. It was a mugshot, sharp and unforgiving under fluorescent light. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. I scrolled. Article after article unfurled like a nightmare I hadn't realized I was living. They called him a con artist, a career fraudster, a man who had posed as a businessman to swindle women out of their savings. Court records listed accusations like receipts, stolen credit cards, falsified checks, rental scams. His life was a trail of debts and broken promises, stretching back years, maybe decades. My mouth went dry. My coffee had gone cold, untouched. I clicked deeper, almost punishing myself. There were forums too, whole threads filled with women who told their stories. Their words cut me open because they could have been my own. He always pays in cash. He avoids cameras, won't let you take pictures. He promises a future, but disappears when you ask too many questions. One woman's post made me grip the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. He made me feel like I was the only one. Then he drained my savings and left me with nothing. I slammed the laptop shut, so fast the screen rattled. My breath came in gasps, ragged and loud in the silence. I pressed my palms against the cool wood of the table as though it could anchor me, but the floor still seemed to tilt beneath my feet. It was too late. The truth had burned its way into me, searing through every fragile excuse I had built. The man I thought was my dream was a con artist. Once you know the truth, you can't unsee it. It's like a film ripped away from your eyes. Every memory I thought was precious began to replay in my mind, rewritten, tainted, almost mocking me. The jazz club? I had been so charmed when he greeted the saxophonist by name, thinking it proved his sophistication. Now I realized it was probably a trick, the kind of hollow familiarity anyone can fake with enough bravado. The steak dinner he swore he cooked himself? I remembered the packaging I had glimpsed in his bag, likely from a deli down the street. And the poetry, those lines he whispered under the stars? A quick Google search revealed them word for word on a free website. Nothing original, nothing real. The lies weren't just about the past. They were woven into every corner of the present. I dug deeper, pulling at threads until the entire fabric began to unravel. His so-called business trips suddenly made chilling sense when I matched the dates to lawsuits I found online. He wasn't flying across the country to close deals. He was running cons. And those late nights when he said he was with clients? I compared them to local news stories and found they lined up perfectly with reports of scams in nearby towns. Then I turned to my own finances. At first, I wanted to believe I hadn't given him much, but the numbers told a different story. Twice, I had covered his bills because his money was tied up. At the time, it seemed harmless. After all, he promised to pay me back. And then there was the $5,000 I had lent him for an investment. He had looked me in the eyes, taken my hands in his, and sworn he would return it within weeks, double even. I believed him. Of course I did. Now those transactions glared at me from my bank statement like open wounds. The worst discovery came late one night, my living room lit only by the glow of my laptop. I clicked through social media profiles under the other name I'd found. And there it was, a photograph. Daniel, or whatever his real name was, had his arm draped around a smiling woman. She looked radiant, her head tilted against his chest. The caption read, "To new beginnings." The date made my heart seize. 3 months ago. Right in the middle of the nights, he was telling me I was the only one who had ever understood him. While I was memorizing the sound of his laugh, he was building another fantasy life with someone else. I sat frozen, clutching the dried rose he had given me on that first day. I had kept it as a symbol of hope, of a new chapter in my life. But in the dim light, the petals looked brittle, colorless, lifeless. It was no longer a reminder of romance. It was proof of death, the death of trust, of innocence, of the life I thought I was stepping into. That was when the final truth settled over me, heavy and undeniable. He wasn't just lying to me for fun or out of habit. He was preparing to strip me of everything, my money, my home, maybe even my dignity. And if I didn't stop him, he would succeed. I spent the next few days preparing, though it felt less like preparation and more like battle. My dining table turned into a war room. I printed screenshots of the news articles, copies of forum posts from other women, my own bank statements highlighting the money that had vanished. The Facebook photo of him with another woman was the final dagger, placed on top like a crown of shame. Each page slid into a plain manila folder, simple and unassuming, but heavier in my hands than any weapon. Friday evening arrived like a storm. I stood in front of the mirror before dinner, brushing my hair back with trembling fingers. My reflection looked pale, older than usual, but my eyes burned with something I hadn't felt in years. Resolve. Daniel showed up right on time, as polished as ever. A bottle of wine in one hand, his other reaching to kiss my cheek. "Smells wonderful," he said, glancing toward the kitchen. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, as if nothing in the world were out of place. I forced a smile, though my stomach twisted. "It's chicken, with herbs." We sat. I poured the wine. My hands shook only once, but I steadied them on the edge of the table. The meal stretched out in unbearable slowness, every word he spoke like static in my ears. He talked about a deal in Seattle, about a friend who needed capital. Lies upon lies, delivered with the same practiced ease that had once charmed me. I waited until his glass was nearly to his lips. Then, with a calm I didn't recognize as my own, I slid the folder across the table. "Read," I said. His eyes flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. He opened the folder, flipping through the pages one by one. A mug shot, an article headline, bank records, the Facebook photo. I watched his smile dissolve like sugar in boiling water. Finally, he chuckled. Low, cold, dangerous. "You don't understand," he said, voice edged with mockery. Those women lied. Those charges were dropped. People are jealous of me. Jealous of us. But his hands gave him away. They shook as he turned the pages, his knuckles tightening around the paper. I leaned forward, my voice steady but barely above a whisper. I trusted you. You picked the wrong woman this time. His mask cracked. The warmth drained from his eyes, leaving behind something sharp, something predatory. His face hardened. Careful, he hissed. You don't know who you're dealing with. A chill spread down my spine, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I rose slowly, deliberately, and crossed to the phone on the counter. The kitchen light hummed above me, filling the silence. I dialed. Each button beep sounded louder than thunder. The line connected. My voice came out clear, almost detached. I need to report a fraud. He's here. Daniel's eyes widened. For the first time since I had met him, the mask of confidence shattered. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. And in that instant, I realized something I would never forget. The man who made me feel powerless was finally afraid of me. The silence in the house after I hung up the phone was deafening. Daniel sat rigid across from me, the folder still open, his jaw clenched as if he were trying to piece together his next move. I could see his mind working, calculating, spinning lies, deciding whether to beg, threaten, or bolt. For once, none of it mattered. When the knock came on the door, sharp and commanding, Daniel flinched. I rose, my legs shaky but determined, and opened it to two uniformed officers. Their presence filled the entryway with authority, the gleam of their badges brighter than I had ever imagined something so ordinary could be. "Ma'am, we got your call," one of them said. I pointed back toward the dining table. "He's right there. And that folder, everything you need." Daniel immediately stood, his smile snapping back into place like a mask he had worn 1,000 times. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, adjusting his jacket, "this is all a misunderstanding. I can explain." But the officers weren't listening to charm. One flipped through the folder, his expression hardening at each page. The other asked Daniel for ID. His hands twitched as he reached into his wallet, but I knew what they would find. Another name, another lie. Within minutes, his wrists were cuffed, the metallic snap echoing through my dining room like a closing door. I stood in the doorway as they led him out, his protests growing louder, more desperate. "She's lying! This is revenge! You don't know what you're doing!" But the neighbors had already started peeking through their curtains. Porch lights clicked on. Eyes followed him as he stumbled toward the patrol car. And for once, he wasn't the gallant gentleman, the polished suitor, the charming investor. He was exposed for what he truly was, a criminal. I wrapped my arms around myself as the cruiser pulled away, the flashing red and blue lights painting my quiet street in harsh, pulsing color. The folder still sat on my dining table, open and damning, its pages fluttering slightly in the draft from the door. When the silence finally returned, it felt different. Emptier, but also cleaner, like a storm had passed through and carried something toxic away. Later, my daughter rushed to my side, her face pale with shock when I told her what had happened. She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with tears, "you were braver than you know." I wanted to laugh or cry or maybe both. Brave? That wasn't what I had felt as I watched him smile and lie as I dialed those numbers with shaking hands. I had felt terrified, exposed, shattered. But maybe bravery isn't about feeling strong. Maybe it's about moving forward even when every part of you is broken. That night, I slept with the window cracked open. The cool air carried the scent of rain and pine into my room, and for the first time in months, I didn't dream of roses or candlelight. I dreamed of freedom. Whether in handcuffs or in confusion, Daniel lost his power the moment I chose myself over his lies. The decision was mine, not his. For so long, I had let him set the stage, the flowers, the dinners, the whispered promises under dimmed lights. He was the director, and I was the audience, believing the story he performed. But in the end, I realized I could walk out of the theater. I could choose not to applaud. He thought he had taken everything from me: my money, my time, my faith in love. But there is one thing a con artist can never steal: the dignity of a woman who finally decides she deserves better. It took nights of silence and mornings filled with doubt for me to understand that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't come with grand speeches or flashing headlines. It comes in the quiet, steady choices we make when no one is watching. Closing a bank account, changing a lock, picking up the phone and saying, "Enough." For weeks afterward, I caught myself glancing at my phone, half expecting one of his messages to slip through. The old me, the one who wanted so badly to believe, would have felt a pull to answer. But now, even the thought of his voice felt like static, like background noise in a life I no longer wanted. I kept the folder, though. The articles, the screenshots, the photo of him with that other woman. Not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. A reminder that trust must be earned, not given away simply because someone is charming enough to ask for it. When I feel myself slipping into old habits, wanting to ignore red flags, wanting to quiet my intuition, I open that folder, and I remember. Sometimes, late at night, I walk out to the small garden behind my house. There's a patch of bare earth where the rose he gave me used to sit in a vase, its petals crumbling to dust. I buried those petals in the soil. And now, weeks later, a fresh green shoot has started to rise in their place. Life renewing itself, uninvited but unstoppable. I like to think of it as my own rebirth, proof that even something dead and false can nourish something living and true. My daughter tells me I inspire her, though I laugh when she says it. I don't feel like a heroine. I feel like a woman who stumbled into a storm and somehow crawled her way out. But maybe that's all inspiration really is, showing others that survival is possible, even when you're convinced it isn't. Daniel may haunt the corners of my memory, but he no longer controls the narrative. He is not the final chapter. I am. He took my trust, but I kept my dignity. And in the end, that dignity became my freedom. And that is something no con artist, no matter how clever, can ever steal.